Today we will be talking about how to write your essay for To Kill a Mockingbird that we have finished reading. The question you're going to answer in your essay is, what characters does this mockingbird symbolize? Or in other words, what characters does the mockingbird represent in the story? To start thinking about this essay, we're going to consider the characteristics of a mockingbird, or in other words, what is a mockingbird like? What do we know about them? So we're going to read the quote from the book that really highlights the symbol of the mockingbird in the story. And this is what it says. Mockingbirds don't do one thing except make music for us to enjoy. They don't eat up people's gardens. They don't nest in corn cribs. They don't do one thing but sing their hearts out for us. That's why it's a sin to kill a mockingbird. So from this quote, we're going to consider how we would describe mockingbirds. So I gave this some thought, and based on this quote, I thought about what are two words we could use to characterize mockingbirds. So I came up with two that we could use for our essay: vulnerable and helpful. Vulnerable meaning that mockingbirds need protection. They can't take care of themselves. They need others to watch out for them. That's why it's so wrong to kill them. And they're helpful. They're kind. They try to do good things and help us. They play music for us. Again, why it's so wrong to kill them. Now we need to connect these characteristics to the characters in the story. So how are these characters like the mockingbirds? So under characteristics of mockingbirds, I wrote vulnerable and helpful, because those are what we said mockingbirds are like. And then I picked three characters from the story: Tom, Jem, and Boo. And we're going to think about how Tom, Jem, and Boo are vulnerable in the story and are helpful in the story. And we're going to come up with examples. So this is where you need to really think about the story and come up with your own ideas. I came up with an example for how Tom is vulnerable. So I wrote that in the story, the men tried to take him from the jail. And as you remember, he would have been taken if it hadn't been for Atticus, who stood there and sat there and protected him. So this shows how Tom is vulnerable because of the racism of the time. He needed protection to not be hurt. Then I would think about Jem. When did Jem need protection in the story? Who does he need protection from? What happened? What's an example in the story that would help me show that he is vulnerable? How about Boo? When was he vulnerable? When did he need protection? So again, I look for a part of the story where this is the case. Then for helpful, I'm also looking for examples of when Tom, Jem, and Boo were doing something helpful for someone. When were they trying to do something good or kind for someone else? And I would fill in those examples for Tom, Jem, and Boo. So to summarize, right, the whole point of our essay, we've given some thought to examples. We write our thesis, the main point of the essay. And that sentence is, the mockingbird symbolizes Tom, Jem, and Boo because they were vulnerable and helpful. For each of the characters, you're going to write a paragraph supporting the idea that they are like the mockingbird, that the mockingbird symbolizes them. So you're going to fill in the name, and then you're going to give examples of how they were vulnerable and how that character was helpful. Again, one paragraph per person. So here is our first paragraph, our first body paragraph. It's going to be about Tom. So I start by having my first sentence say what this paragraph is going to be about, right? The assertion, and it's about Tom. So I wrote, the mockingbird symbolizes Tom because he is vulnerable and helpful. That's what I'm trying to show or prove. Now I give my example. In the story, a group of men try to take Tom from the jail to hurt him. That's my example from the story as to why Tom is vulnerable. Now I explain it. This shows he is vulnerable because he needs protection from the community who want to take justice into their own hands. So now I've talked about what my paragraph is going to be about, the first sentence, my assertion, then I gave an example and an explanation for how he is vulnerable. Next, I need to explain why he is helpful. Also in the story, here I would write my example of where in the story he was helpful. Then I explain it. This shows that Tom is helpful because, and in my own words, I connect the example from the story to how Tom is showing that he is kind and helpful, like the mockingbird. These examples prove that Tom is like the mockingbird in the story. Body paragraph 2 is about Jem, right? So now my first sentence is not about Tom, it's about Jem. The mockingbird symbolizes Jem because he was vulnerable and helpful. Now I give an example of how he was vulnerable. In the story, and again, here you fill in, when was it that Jem needed protection? Then you explain. This shows that Jem was vulnerable because, and explain how he needed protection. Also in the story, and here you give an example of when Jem was helpful, something that happened in the story. This shows that Jem was helpful because, and again explain how this shows that he was being kind. These examples prove that Jem was like the mockingbird in the story. Body paragraph 3 is about Boo, and so the first sentence says, the mockingbird symbolizes Boo because he was vulnerable and helpful. And then you go on to give examples and explanations as to how Boo was vulnerable and then how Boo was helpful. I have written the introduction for us. Again, the introduction is the first paragraph in an essay. Starts with something interesting, so I put in the quote that we got from the book because it's famous and it catches people's attention, the hook. Then I wrote a sentence to connect that quote to our thesis, and the last paragraph in my introduction you might recognize is our thesis. So here's how our introduction reads. In To Kill a Mockingbird, Harper Lee writes, mockingbirds don't do one thing except make music for us to enjoy. That's why it's a sin to kill a mockingbird. This quote tells us that mockingbirds are kind creatures that should not be harmed. In the story, the mockingbird symbolizes Tom, Jem, and Boo because they are vulnerable and helpful. So the last paragraph of our essay is called the conclusion. For this paragraph, we repeat the thesis and then we give some final thoughts. Why is this important today? How does this connect to our world today, this idea of a mockingbird that was used as a symbol in the story? So, again, I start with my thesis. In the story, the mockingbird symbolizes Tom, Jem, and Boo because they are vulnerable and helpful. All of these characters need protection and care from more powerful characters in the story. So that's my connecting sentence there, that I connect my thesis to what I'm going to talk about today, how it's important now. In our world today, so here's the connection to today, mockingbirds are, so here you want to think about who do you think mockingbirds are around you today? Who are people that are vulnerable, meaning they need protection, and helpful? They're kind, they try to do good things, so they fit with the symbols from the story. People need to protect these mockingbirds because, and this is really where you give the final thoughts. So just like in the story, it was important that Atticus protected Tom and Jem and Boo, and other characters in the story protected them as well. It is important that we protect mockingbirds today. Why? Why is it important that we do that? Put in your thoughts there to kind of finish up your paper with your own ideas. Now you are ready to type your essay. Remember that the order of the paragraphs is introduction first, then body paragraph 1, then body paragraph 2, then body paragraph 3, and finally the conclusion. When you type your essay and submit it to Canvas, make sure you've used the MLA format. That means that you need 12-point font. The font should be in Times New Roman style, and your paper should be double spaced. And you start with the heading and the title. So here's the example. You have your name, then you write Mrs. Buckley, English 9, and the date. If you start this Friday, you would write Friday's date, and then the title, Mockingbirds. If you have any questions about the essay, how to write your paragraphs, please reach out to us via email or come to one of the Google Meet times and ask questions. We are happy to help you if you feel stuck or that any part of this is difficult. All right? Good luck and get to work.